This segment, we're going to talk about social capital and the importance of social capital in communities. And it really is it's hard to argue that there, at the present time in our circumstances, in this 21st century moment, that there might not be an issue more important at the community level than social capital. And so, what is social capital? Social capital uses sort of an economic concept of capital to um, to identify the asset of having a relationship among people and functions of society, connections among individuals, norms, trust among persons in communities, and ways that people interact that really create moral standards, human values, networks. And these networks really transcend economics, but they also deal with so many of the important relationships that form the backbone and the heart of community life. These concepts really started in the 19th century in America anyway, with the French observer Alexis de Tocqueville, who wrote a series of observations of American life and American democracy. And throughout this time period, and throughout his tour of the United States, he made the observation that one of the things that really stood out of Americans of all ages and stations is their disposition for forming associations, and that our democracy really existed because of this tight-knit web of people together forming these different kinds of associations, not all political, some social, some for the good of others. And that forms the basis of community life. And so Robert Putnam, who is often called, he's a Harvard sociology professor, and he's often called the poet laureate of civil society in the United States. His towering work in the 1990s called Bowling Alone really focused on the importance of social capital for the sake of democracy and community vibrancy. And he's got a new book out that really looks at an updated version of this that's really worth reading. And his argument is that social capital is in significant decline and has been in significant decline in the United States for a long time. Voluntary associations, clubs and organizations down 63%, family dinners down 32%. You can see some ways that we measure and understand social capital: dinner with friends, spontaneous interactions, generalized trust, which is really an important part of the glue that holds the fabric of society together. And so Putnam was very critical of the changing nature of society and things that really happened from the 1970s on, when these declines began to really exacerbate. In his mind, there are a lot of different causes, but he's particularly critical of suburbanization as one of those. And we're going to look at this here in just a moment. And so there are a lot of studies on social capital, as you can imagine, out of Harvard. They did a study with 268 males, and they tracked them and looked at the formula for a happy life. And in most cases, it came down to relationships with all kinds of people in your life. Another really noteworthy study that was done by a hospice nurse, really, who spent a good bit of time hearing what people were saying in their final moments of life. And her study basically came to the determination that 2 of the 3 most common deathbed regrets relate to social capital. The third, by the way, is that people don't live for themselves. They live too much for what others think that they should be doing and not for what they want to do. But 2 of the 3 are relatable to social capital. And if you look at the time studies of how people over the scope of civilization spent their time, if you go back to the hunter-gatherer in the Neolithic Revolution, they worked for 2 to 5 hours a day trying to basically create the food and shelter that their families needed, their community needed. They spent the rest of the time with family in community. The modern human works about 8+ hours a day, spends a lot of time commuting, which is one of Putnam's criticisms. And their free time is most commonly spent in one of the three boxes: the house, the television, or the car. The television, of course, I think is translatable today to the computer or to the device. And so online connections really don't engender the same level of trust as in-person connections. We've seen this really, I think, through the pandemic. And so there's two kinds of social capital that I think we want to talk about here. And that's bridging social capital and bonding social capital. And there's an inherent tension sometimes between these two, because bridging capital is bridging different groups of people based on socioeconomics, based on race, based on, whether you're a soccer person or a basketball person or a baseball person. It doesn't matter what it is. And the opposite of that is bonding capital. And that's all those groups. So where you live, people that look like you, that go to your church, that go to your school, that all are on the same type of teams, that go to the same high school and are in the same fan base for that high school in a community like Bowling Green. That's bonding. And you often hear, well, we're tight-knit community. But there sometimes in those tight-knit communities have a tendency to have enclaves that don't ever interface with each other. So the tight-knitness is bonding, but the interface between those tight-knit communities is bridging. And both are important. Kentucky tends to have higher, and small cities tend to have higher bonding and lower bridging. And of course, Bowling Green, I think you see this with some of the residential segregation. You see it with the different immigrant communities, and you see it with the college and the university community and everyone else. You see it with the more suburban and the downtown. And this is a common thing that you see in small cities. And so for the potential for social capital formation is really greater in high diversity than low diversity communities. And so diversity is a really critical part of strong and healthy communities and how you create bridging social capitals. And so, doing this through the built environment is really one of the things that we have seen in the research that's becoming a very prominent piece. But before we get to the built environment in a city, let's say just a few words about the economy and social capital. There's a really strong correlation between the index of social capital on the left, which for this one, the darker is lower and the lighter is higher, and the economic distress index, which is in the map below. And for that one, the darker blue is less distress. The darker red and orange is more distress. And so if you look at that, you can see, though, even though the color schemes are different, you can see very similar geographic trends to where there's a high correlation of economic distress and low social capital. And conversely, there's a high correlation of lesser levels of economic distress and higher levels of social capital. And you can see the examples of a couple of small cities that are a couple of state small cities, but a couple of out-of-state small cities. And you can see the correlation: very low economic distress in Dubuque and La Crosse, and very high levels of social capital. And you can see Owensboro and Bowling Green are similar in both their levels of social capital and their levels of economic distress. And both of those are lower than the other two. And so let's talk a little bit about community development patterns and the built environment. And depending on the order that you listen to some of these the lectures, we will talk a little bit about these community development patterns, the suburban development pattern versus the urban development pattern in the built environment. The built environment in a traditional neighborhood setting, and when we say traditional, we mean all of civilization prior to the invention of the car. The invention of the car threw a loop into everything. And then since the invention of the car, we've been in this suburban sprawl development pattern. Prior to the invention of the car, the built environment was really centered around a main core of town with residential as a periphery. But you notice here that this is very walkable. So you can walk from home to work, you can walk from home to school, or you can walk from home to shop. If you go down to the suburban pattern, the one that Putnam is critical of, and the one that so much of the challenges with social capital have really centered on, you see these suburban residential patterns. And so if you live here and you go to school here, you can't walk to school without going through some field and probably climbing a fence. You go this way, all the way out to the collector road. And if you're walking or riding a bike, you risk your life getting to school safely. And so this is really built around the automobile only. This is built around a mix of uses, a mix of modalities, and a mix of people, different kinds of housing, different kinds of opportunities, work, shopping, school, and home. And so you get back into the three boxes when you go here. You talk about spending your time in the cul-de-sac, the box of the house, the box that you're in within the house, and of course, the box that you have to get in and out of all day long to go back and forth, to shop, to go to school, to work, and everything else. And so a balance of those needs really becomes prominent. And so what we've noticed is that the quality of place is very definitely aligned to social capital and leadership in a community. And so, this connection to the built environment, using a predictor variable of the walk score in a community, but also levels of obesity and diabetes in a community, shows those communities that have built environments that are more walkable versus more suburban. And what we've noticed is that the communities that are more diverse, that are more inclusive, have balanced leadership, have better quality of place, they have higher levels of social capital and stronger communities, and their community distress is much lower. And so the built environment is highly predictive of high levels of social capital. And it's natural because it lends itself to people interacting with one another in multiple modalities and multiple ways on the street and in community. And so there is a very definite intersect between prosperous, successful, happy communities, the kind of leadership that you have in that community, the social capital, and the quality of the built environment in that community. And so as we talk in this course about new urbanism, there are some very simple ways to create this interaction and create enhanced social capital. One is with mixed use zoning, having walkable neighborhoods with interaction that creates a lot of this bridging opportunities. Mixed housing, shapes, sizes, price points, and diversity is another way. And a very simple way in a neighborhood, creating a back-loaded car situation where the front of those homes look a little more like a sidewalk street without interruptions for garages, creates much more interaction at the street level, and it's designed more evenly around the car and the person. And so the idea of placemaking in ways that you can sort of create an identity and create welcoming public sphere of the community is really an important component of creating a built environment that enhances social capital along the way.